The fact that Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the best games ever made requires no denial. That's just how it is, and most people who play this completely agree with me. And that is out of the question. But under the question is how it managed to do this. How the game that no one thought that would be that successful managed to sweep all game awards in 2023 and became a universally acclaimed game of the year by almost every outlet. So in this video I want to discuss just that, but not in a way that you might think. This is not a simple reviewing of what this game is doing great, but discussing of decisions and choices that this game actually made, allowing it to reach the huge success and change the gaming industry forever. And yeah, a lot of things should go right in order to reach the success like this game did. In this case, they managed to do it almost everything right. So let's discuss just that. And the first reaction of why this game reached success would be because it's deserved it and because it's an amazing game and things like that. But the truth is in details. Game's greatness is not just defined by saying it's great. It's the sum of all things that this game consists of. And not just game itself, but how it's done and why the things done the way they're done. And let's start with the first and most obvious one, and it is the setting of the game. Does the setting of Baldur's Gate 3 had a huge effect on the game's success? Well, let's discuss this briefly. First things first, you can call this game setting in few different ways. Yeah, mostly they will converge to a single thing, but still, some people are attributing this game's success to its franchise, the Baldur's Gate. But in reality, there is very low chance of this happening, because despite previous two games being quite successful, they were not really the mainstream games, not even remotely close what BG3 achieved. Plus, they came out quite a while ago, so their effect on BG3 was quite negligible, if any at all. Was its D&D setting a huge effect? Well, I hear it's not that big of an effect as well, because absolute majority of the gamers that played Baldur's Gate 3 had never done anything closely related to D&D, and me included. I never played any tabletop games, and I cannot remember the games that I played in D&D setting. Plus, despite D&D having very dedicated fan base, because D&D is very niche fantasy setting and very hardcore at that, so you cannot really attribute success of Baldur's Gate 3 to D&D settings. Even its richness and depth had effect on it, I doubt that it was a huge one. So the last and most broad explanation of Baldur's Gate setting is just fantasy. So would it be as successful if it was not a fantasy setting and was something completely different? Well, maybe not. Fantasy setting allows you to do a bunch of different things without really explaining them and not grounding them into reality. But you can do the same thing in other settings, like for example sci-fi. Would Baldur's Gate 3 be successful with all of those things but in complete different settings like sci-fi? So in short conclusion, setting of the game did not really have a big effect on this game's success. So what's the story of Baldur's Gate 3 that had a huge effect on its success? Well, I would not say that as well, because despite this game having pretty great main story, it was not really anything amazing. Yeah, I really have yet to see people that was praising the game solely because of its story. Yeah, it is pretty good and I actually really enjoyed it, but it did not really grip me that much. So what was it? Well, first thing that was a huge contributing factor is the freedom that world actually provided to you. Yes, we have played a bunch of different RPGs and fantasy games, but very few games allowed you to completely different story objectives and any objectives at all in as different ways as Baldur's Gate 3 does. Even though the ways of completing objectives are not really unlimited, you still have a lot of different ways to do so, and this freedom was a breath of fresh air for the most gamers. Yes, we have seen a lot of open worlds and a lot of detailed open worlds, but very few games gives you the ability to use everything around you at your disposal to complete the objectives in as different ways as Baldur's Gate 3 does. And this freedom was one of the contributing factors why people actually love this game. But this cannot be all true, because despite not a lot of games allowing you this amount of choices, there's still some games that do and still did not reach the nearest enough success as Baldur's Gate 3 did. As an example, the previous Larian games, Divinity Original Sin series. Gameplay wise, you can do a lot of things similarly, yet you do not see hundreds of thousands of players playing Divinity Original Sin 2 or getting as many Game of the Years as BG3 did. So what Baldur's Gate 3 did differently? One word: presentation. All those games, despite having a huge freedom, huge worlds, amazing fantasy settings, they lacked presentation. And by presentation, I mean how the world around you and how the story is actually presented to you. And Baldur's Gate 3 did an excellent job with it. By having cutscenes and dialogue scenes just like in Mass Effect series, having fully voice acted characters except maybe player-made character, and having amazingly directed and voiced cutscenes, this game has an insanely good presentation that paired with the freedom and the world building around you just gives you an insanely amazing feeling of gameplay. Yes, despite story not being an amazing thing, even average thing presented well had a huge impact on the game, and in this case it had, and that was a huge contributing factor why people absolutely loved this game and if its broad appeal, even though its setting made it quite difficult for the newcomers to understand and play well. But with the freedom and presentation, they had an incentive to do that because They wanted to see what else they can do and how else the story will develop. But all this was understandable. But how did they get there? And how they still managed to reach the success? And one of the answers was its development cycle. You see, many of you do not know that Baldur's Gate 3 was an early access title that launched in 2020 and only full version launched in 2023. And an early access launch was bare bones of the game, and it was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger with every iteration, and every iteration was being changed based on gamers' feedback. This allowed gamers themselves to be an active part of the development, and this way Larian and dev team created the game that gamers wanted, not what they themselves deemed the perfect game. And that is very important, because usually early access launch is just made to have an additional funding in a development, while in this case early access launch had an actual effect on development other than the financial wise. Also, it actually showed Larian what gamers actually wanted, and their next decision was based practically on that, and it is the packaging. And by packaging I mean that they made this game as a final deal. No DLCs, no expansions, no nothing. You would get what you would get, just like in old school. The game would be finished and only things that would be added in the game were bug fixes and some updates. Nothing huge or significant, and especially nothing paid. And that decision was huge, because very few developers are actually doing that anymore. You're basically packaging the game as an ultimate value, where you will get everything that you want just by purchasing it once, without being afraid that the parts of the game would be cut out just to sell you later. And that is an important thing for the gamers, and that created the gamers' trust. And because of transparent early access development, the gamers knew and understood that what they were getting was an insanely high value product. But Larian managed to do one more small thing that ensured the game's success, and it's correct pricing. You see, many AAA developers are pricing the game $70 because of how the cost of developments have increased, while Larian stuck to old school. And by old school I mean not just selling the fully finished game, but also for the old school price, $60. And that way they showed the gamers their confidence of the game, and also how much better value this game is compared to everything else. And that actually worked. Pricing strategies affecting players is not a new thing, and you can actually see in real time how pricing affects the game. You see, when the game released, it reached a peak players of 875,000 players on Steam, and since then it's dropping. Completely normal. Game is not a live service, game does not have an active multiplayer except for the co-op, and game is not getting any content updates. So people are completing the game and then moving on, and that's completely understandable. But you also see is a little bumps when more players are joining the game. And why it's happening? In the case of Baldur's Gate 3, you see that in November 2023 you had an average of 100,000 players with a peak of 203,000 players. But in January 2024 you had average of 160,000 and peak players of 297,000 players. Why? One answer: Steam sales. You see, many people still cannot afford buying game for the full price, and what they usually wait is the sales. And winter sales is one of those major sales, which is incidentally happening in the months of December and January. In this case, in December 2023 you had a Steam sale where the game price was actually dropped only by 10%. Yes, even though it's not a huge drop for the game that launched just a few months before, that's actually a pretty good deal. So a lot of people jumped on it, and it actually worked by increasing player numbers by 50%. Yes, even though since then the gamers numbers are dropping, but it's again completely normal. You will see the player number increase again during the next major sales. Overall, Baldur's Gate 3 is a testament of how the game should be made, and showing that the player's first approach will work the best no matter what. Oh yeah, and if you want to watch my Baldur's Gate actual review, you can watch it right here. Or if you like maybe other RPG games and want to know more about RPG games, you can watch my list of best RPG games right here. Oh yeah, and don't forget to subscribe right here as well. This is Report Day, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. See ya and take care.